Welcome, everyone. I'm Maya Trotz, and today I'll be speaking with Dr. Wazir Mohamed, an associate professor of sociology at Indiana University East in Richmond, Indiana. At one point, he was the co-leader of the Working People's Alliance prior to going to Binghamton to do his graduate studies and then entering academia. Before that, however, he had long worked with the Working People's Alliance and with Dr. Walter Rodney in Guyana. Today, he's going to present on the history of land tenure in Guyana, taking us back to periods of colonization and pretty much how our coastal plain developed. I will first give some history in terms of the area that we're speaking of, just so that we're all on the same page when we hear the term sea dam, crown dam, sideline dam. Wazir will then give the historical context of land tenure and open up the discussion. What does it mean to have this knowledge and to think of what equitable and caring and just communities look like in Guyana? When we speak of Guyana, we're speaking of the only English-speaking country in South America, bordered by Venezuela, Brazil, and Suriname. Majority of the population in Guyana lives in the coastal area, this coastal zone next to the Atlantic Ocean. We're going to be talking about both where we had sugar estates on our west coast and east coast. And this is the Atlantic out here that we're looking at. As we look at these coastal areas, they are filled with villages, one after the other. And these villages go from the Atlantic Ocean in terms of the coastal villages back to what would have been called a crown dam. And now those, through irrigation connections, they go back even further to what we now call Conservancy Dams. So in the coast, we have what would have been called a sea dam. We call it a seawall right now. Under the Dutch, enslaved Africans built these walls to protect us from the Atlantic Ocean. The coastal zone is all reclaimed land, and so at high tide, the Atlantic would have washed in. And so we have built hard infrastructure, and we have mangroves that would be our softer or green infrastructure. The seawall's gray infrastructure, the mangroves green infrastructure that helped with eco-based system adaptation for things like climate change right now. Lots of initiatives to bring the more mangroves back along the coast. These seawalls are also interfaced with drains, and these are larger drains that would form sort of that sideline dam separating villages. But these would also drain out to the Atlantic. And so to drain out to the Atlantic when tides were low, you have these cokers, and then they're closed when at high tide, you don't want the sea coming in. The canals would have gone back to a crown dam. And now there's conservancy dams, which are large conservancy areas developed for wider scale irrigation and water provision. So these are our villages, lots of agricultural land behind them. And then you can see the conservancy area here, which are large wetland areas. Here is another image of the East Demerara Water Conservancy and the catchment areas that drain into it. In 2005, I think it was, when we had floods that were pretty bad, I actually rented a plane and was able to fly over to sort of get an idea of what this looks like. I had no idea of what it looked like growing up, that all of this was behind us, dammed in, and that in front of us we're dammed in from the sea also. I will hand it over to Wazir. Now we have some idea of like the type of landscape that we're looking at and how vulnerable that is.
When Guyana was colonized in the 16th and the 17th century, nobody was living in this space that we now call the coastland. All the plantations were up and down the riverine communities, up and down the rivers. That is why you have what we call forts at the mouth of the Essequibo River, or that's why we have those. These lands were actually, the reclamation of these lands were done in the Dutch period beginning in 1721. And so to reclaim this land from the sea, which is 6 feet below sea level. So when the sea came in, it would cover this entire land. And then when the water goes out at low tide, the land would be there again. So the Dutch, under the Dutch period, the labor of the enslaved was used to produce each one of these rectangles that we are seeing on the map. Whether we're talking from the Essequibo coast, the West Demerara, East Bank Demerara, or the East Coast. Each of these rectangles were constructed as plantation spaces, precisely with what is called a sea dam from in front to prevent the seawater from encroaching, and a crown dam behind to prevent the water coming from the savannas and the highland runoff to come in and flood the land. Now that was not enough, because to construct a habitable space, what was also needed was drainage. But at that time, drainage was gravity feed. That is, you had to construct drainage. So when there is low tide, the water could run off the land and be kept off. But in order to produce agriculture, you see, Guyana was developing as a colony in that period when irrigation became important. And so 3 canals were dug in each of these rectangular spaces. There were 2 sideline canals that had to do with drainage, because you had to drain the land. And then you had a middle canal. I mean, in Buxton, the people would know it as the Buxton Middle Walk. In many of the villages, it became known as the Middle Walk, because it is where the laborers would walk, or it is that canal that would be used in the plantation period to transport labor, to transport materials to the inner areas of the plantation. These plantations had at the front end, across about 100 to 120 rods, or about 1/3 of a mile in width, and with a depth of about 500 to 750 rods, depending on where you were in the country, or about 2¼ miles inland. So the whole plantation space was located within that catchment area in which the planters lived. The Africans, when they were brought, when they were enslaved, were brought there to live and put to live. Everybody was living in that area. They had the factories there, and so everything was organized within these rectangular spaces, which today we know as the villages. All the villages across the coast was before a plantation at some point. And we will go into that history a little later down. Guyana was not a blank slate when the British took over at the beginning of the 19th century. But when the British took over, remember, you had industrialization. Capitalism was being born in Europe and in Great Britain. And Great Britain was suing for free trade so that it could trade outside of its colonies, that it could garner all the produce, all the raw materials being produced in different parts of the world. And so Guyana, when Guyana became British, it fell into that complexity as the world system began to develop and expand at the beginning of the 19th century. But although Guyana had its land endowment, it did not have its capacity, its labor force, to meet its land endowment. In fact, Eric Williams said that for Guyana to be a successful colony, it needed at least 2 million laborers at that time. We only had 100,000. But when the British took over also, the British took over a colony that was diversified. A colony that was producing cotton, coffee, and sugar. which was being sold in the world economy. Now, in that beginning period of the 19th century, for those of us who understand world history, would know that Brazil became the main producer and supplier of coffee in the world market. In fact, I visited the Paraiba Valley in 2009. And Cuba became the premier sugar colony, which was not British. We were supplying sugar in the world economy as industrialization expanded. And the United States became the main supplier, producer and supplier of cotton in the world economy, all products that were required for industrialization or for the industrial economy in Great Britain. So Guyana found itself at that crossroad. As a result of that, what happened? The planter class decided that they were going to convert Guyana from a diversified economy into a one-crop sugar economy, which they successfully did between 1815 and until the sugar industry the rice industry got established at the end of the 19th century. To do that, it meant that you had to consolidate plantation space. So you had to bring several of these plantations together into one industrial enterprise. And you had to consolidate the available labor force. And in order to make it industrial, to produce at the rate that you needed to produce to be able to make a profit, it meant that you had to suppress labor. So in British Guyana, in that early 19th century, between 1815 and 1838, at the time of emancipation, slavery was the worst for more than any other part of the British Caribbean, because Guyana's economy began to divert. You see, Guyana, I know that the history has told, and this is why Walter Rodney said, we have to rekindle this history, that we have to re-evaluate the history, we have to understand it, we have to go back into it. Because really, Guyana historically belongs to what happened in South America. We have nothing that binds us historically to the Caribbean, except for the fact that Guyana was a British colony. So Guyana became a one-crop sugar economy. But what makes Guyana important in that period is the fact that the sugar became concentrated mostly in Demerara. So that is how we got Demerara crystals. Yeah, Alison Stahl has done her work. Alison Stahl was teaching at university. I hope she's on this call. She did her work in which she studied the evolution of how technology evolved in the sugar industry in the 19th century. And in her work and in the work of Nigel Westmus, who is also listening, he has shown that industrial technologies such as steam engine, which had just come into being in England, was being transferred to Demerara and in Guyana in that period. In fact, the vacuum pan technology that allowed the Demerara crystals to develop or to be manufactured was first employed in an estate on the Essequibo coast, I think it's Land of Plenty, and then later at Breeden Hoop, Gladstone's estate at Breeden Hoop. That is why Demerara crystals is so sought after in the supermarkets today. So Guyana contributed a lot, but what is important about this space? Because water, in order to ensure that we could produce sugar economically, water had to become the most important driving force. So the plantation space was configured by the British to ensure that they could move raw materials cheaply, that you could move labor cheaply, that you could move the finished product, the raw materials from the field to the factory cheaply, and that you could use water as a means of creating energy for the factories. So water became an important tool. But there were other tools that had to be used, and I'm going to get to that. Because when we talk about the suppression of labor, within this period, we had the 1823 slave rebellion on the east coast of Demerara. Now, I'm not going to go into the whole history of the 1823 rebellion, except to say that in terms of land itself, one of the reasons for the rebellion was the fact that the planters decided that they were going to curtail the slave's ability to use what is known as the slave provision grounds. Now, under the law, every enslaved person was entitled to a piece of land on the plantation to produce their own subsistence. Sidney Mintz, in his work, referred to that as a process of what he called resistance and accommodation. But what they did was that they began to curtail the ability of the ex-slaves, of the slaves at that time, to do the necessary work on their provision grounds. You have to remember, you know, people see all the community markets, the Buxton market on the line top, the Pleasance market, the Better Hope market, you know, the market at LBI, the market at Leonora, at Perico, wherever. All these markets were created in that period because these enslaved people were producing provisions on these provision grounds, and they were selling the surplus, what they could not consume themselves, at those markets. The other thing that they did to suppress labor was to address the question of curtailing the enslaved accessing their freedom. Now, before I get into the Land Act itself, there is one other important issue that I need to bring you up to date on. That is one. Cuba, as I said earlier, is the main producer of sugar for the world market. But Cuba, slavery is expanding in Cuba. It is one of the places that slavery expanded after the abolition of the slave trade in 1806. The United States is the other place, and Brazil is the other place. The three places where slavery expanded, and all three places are the places that are producing what is needed for the Industrial Revolution. Now, Guyana is brought into that process as it goes through this process of emancipation. So we have emancipation in the first 10 years after 1838. You have the free villages get established. You have the ex-enslaved organizing themselves in a trade union-like manner to fight for better wages and working conditions. So you had the 1841-42 strike. Then you had the 1847-48 strike. Within that complexity, the British decided that they were going to equalize the duties on sugar in the world market. What that means? This happens in 1846. It meant that slave-produced sugar and free-produced sugar in British Guyana is now meeting in the world market. So free-produced sugar and slave-produced sugar is meeting in the world market. It is within that context that the planter class, in answer to the strike of 1847-48, said to the enslaved that you will have your job back if you're not going to get a raise, and you can only have your job back if you accept a 25% wage cut. Now, the planters already had enough of a complement of indentured labor to take the place of the African population. Remember that the bulk of the African population had not left the plantation in 1838, nor in 1841, nor in 1842, nor in 1843, 44, 45, 46, and 47. The bulk of the population left the sugar plantations after the sugar strike collapse in 1848. So what we are seeing is two things colliding. You have in East Indian immigration colliding with the demands for better wages and working conditions by the former enslaved in the 1840s. So we have to understand the Land Acts, we have to understand the Land Acts within the context of the struggle for freedom. You see, the first set of Land Acts was 1835, 1836, 1839. Essentially, what was done, the British employed what was called the Gibbon-Wakefield process. Gibbon-Wakefield is a colonialist who was sent to Australia and New Zealand to develop a process on how you could address the question of the curtailment of freedom through the use of land. So what they decided to do was to pass in 1836 and 39 a Land Act that says that any lands beyond the Crown Dam can only be accessed in 100-acre parcels at £1 British pound per acre, or at that time it was about $4 or to $4.80 Guyana. That law was again changed in 1851, and the price per acre was raised to $5 an acre. And then it was again changed in 1861, and when the price was changed to $10 an acre. 100-acre parcels at $10 an acre, that is for all lands, what is called state lands, what we call state lands. At that time it was called Crown lands, yeah? Lands beyond the Crown Dam. So the idea is, how do you keep African labor in the proximity of the plantation as you import indentured labor? You see, we cannot, sometimes we deal with history as either or, who did more and who got more and who was suppressed more. I don't get into that. This is not about, what we have to do is understand history as a people. Indentured labor was brought. They didn't bring themselves. The enslaved were brought from Africa. They did not bring themselves. And so as a people together, we have to understand this history. And so we have to understand indentured immigration in collusion with the Land Acts, and in the way in which the planter class used indentured immigration and the Land Acts to create an artificial labor market, that is, to defy the laws of demand and supply, and to produce an artificial labor market. What, you know, so those of us who have read Marx knows that Marx calls that the production of an army of unemployed as a means of keeping labor cheap. The Land Acts that was employed was essentially used as a means of keeping labor cheap, or to produce an army of unemployed, which they did produce between 1850 and 1900. At the same time, if we examine in then East Indian indentured immigration, what we see is the imposition of the indentured contract, a most heinous contract, only employed here, with variations in Trinidad and in Mauritius. 3 colonies, all 3 colonies producing sugar for the British Empire. So, what is it do we have? African workers in the sugar industry, African workers, make a note of that. Because the bulk of the workforce in the sugar industry from 1838 to 1848 are African workers. Let that sink in, because some readings of history tells us differently. I'm reading history from Walter Rodney's playbook, because Walter taught us that our job is to rethink history. If Guyana is to understand itself, if we are ever able to deal with the question of inequality and structural inequality, we have to understand history. And all Guyanese have to understand history and to come to grips with this history. So, the villages, the villages, what is called the free villages, became overcrowded after 1848, after the collapse of the sugar strike in 1848. And so the map that I give you is a map in which, when I was doing my PhD, I had a geographer superimpose an actual village map over the plantation space. This map is, I'm looking for the reference for the map. This map is actually, I got this map in the Guyana Land Archives. I think it was 2007, 2006 or 2007 that I got this map. And it is plan, I can't find the reference.
I'll look for it, Wazir.
But it's, if you can see that this village was bought by 128 ex-slaves. And then after 1848, and by virtue of the Land Acts of 1851, 52, and 56, this land, rather than being subdivided in 128 parcels, was subdivided into 2,138 parcels. Now, let me back up a little. In the 1840s, the parcels, if they were to be subdivided, would have been subdivided with lands divided along the sea dam here in 128 parcels going down towards the back dam. Yeah? The subdivisions that occurred as a result of the Land Acts of 1851, 52, and 56 divided up the land in 3 different ways. That is, shareholders, those who were able to purchase land in the villages, was able to get a piece of their parcel at the beginning, in the first 1/3, another piece in the second 1/3, and another piece in the third, so that you could get good land, not so good land, and bad land. So everybody had a piece of good land, a piece of not so good land, and a piece of bad land. Now, every shareholder in each of these villages, regardless of where we're talking about, whether we're talking about the Essequibo, whether we're talking about the East Coast, whether we're talking about Belize, the East Bank, the West Bank, had between 1/4 and 5 acres, depending on their share. So, but then when we look at the land acts themselves,
Wazir, I wanted you to just clarify where that land would be distributed in a village. And also I saw Vidya Kasoon had his hand raised for a question. So Vidya, if you want to unmute yourself.
Sorry, Amaya. Sorry, good afternoon. My mistake. I lowered the hand. Sorry.
Okay. And also I put the plan number here. So it was
yes. These lands were distributed. Remember, the communal villages, yeah, villages like Buxton, Victoria, etc. When they first took over those villages, they took over those villages to work them as cooperatives, as actually to do cane farming, yes, as cooperatives. They did not have the requisite capital to engage in that kind of agriculture. But then they did something else, this thing that we call ancestral lands, yeah? They designated portions of the front lands for playgrounds, for burial grounds, for churches, for communal use, yeah? And in many villages, they left some of those lands aside for decisions that they would take later down, because they didn't know what kind of communal use. So you still have villages today trying to address the question of what to do with ancestral lands that were not designated. You see? But then there is another issue that we have to address before we forget, and that is when the enslaved were living on the plantations themselves. They had provision grounds, they had burial grounds, yeah? They had and then each plantation had what was called planting walks, or most plantations had what was called planting walks. What was the planting walks for? Planting walks were so that you could have enough planting as a staple for the enslaved population. Good? Now, I mean, after emancipation, I have seen records of at least one planter, Barton Premium, who decided that he was going to just chop down 100 acres of planting walk on his plantation. Yeah? And then there are reports, and Nigel could back me up here, there are reports that Nigel have covered in his work on the newspaper press, in which the newspapers in the mid-1850s are talking about have commentary as to why the planters decided to cut down the planting walks. Now, in my presentation to the Lands Commission, I encourage the Lands Commission to think about ancestral rights in a different way. Because I believe that those planting walks, that the burial grounds that would have been on existing plantations, the provision ground spaces are all and should all be considered ancestral rights. So we have to rethink as a people these constructs and these concepts, and I'm putting that forward for discussion because we need to engage in this discussion. Now, I don't know how long I've spoken for, Maya. You have to keep me on time. I don't want to be too long-winded.
No, you're fine.
Give people a chance to ask questions. So I will make one last point. I'll make one last point. And that is the change of the land laws. Remember the 1835, 36, 39, 51, and 61 land law that says lands beyond the Crown Dam can only be accessed in 100 acre blocks at $10, at $5 and $10 an acre, depending on which time period. And then the law changed in 1898 because sugar. Why the law changed? You see, sugar is so important to our history. The law changed because sugar was in crisis beginning in the mid 1880s. And to address the question of what to do with the crisis in the colony, they changed the law and to offer lands outside, beyond the Crown Dams at 15 cents an acre. And that is how the rice industry got established. While rice was being planted on the plantations itself, on Pontrench dams and stuff like that, by indentured labor from as early as 1865. And rice was being planted by the enslaved for as long as the enslaved lived in the country. The industry only got established after 1898, because it's the only time that an alternative export crop was allowed. You see, there is a reason why we have no maroon communities. There is a reason why Suriname have maroon communities. Haiti have maroon communities. Brazil have maroon communities, that is runaway communities of the enslaved. And the reason for that has to do with the fact that to ensure that all available labor was available for the plantation, the planter class had to employ mechanisms to snuff out every maroon community in the country. So we can take questions. I don't want to be long-winded.
No problem. You had one other thing that you had raised in terms of the small-scale rice farmer, and you'd use this as an example. I think you'd said look at Hague and Den Amstel as two different ways in which size of the plots.
It's a point I made in the introduction to my PhD dissertation. And in that introduction, I don't have my dissertation in front of me, but I mean, you know, my memory serves me correct. What I said is that I had a discussion with a young East Indian whose father left him 40 acres of land in a village adjoining a black village. And we had this discussion about, and I said to him, I said, you know, when you look over to the black villages, what do you see? He said, I see land abandoned, I see people who are lazy. And I said, when you look over your side, what do you see? He said, well, I see progressive people. And I said, well, what else do you see? I said, have you seen these villages using shovel to dig their drainage trenches? He said, yes. And I said, what do you use to dig your drainage trenches? And he said, drag lines. And I said, think about the reason for that. Yeah? And this was in 2006. This is not ancient history, this is 2006. I said, then tell me, I said, your father left you with 40 acres of land, but tell me, what are you doing? What are you making your living from? And he said, well, you know, he have a truck and he's driving his truck in order to make a living. And I said, why can't you make a living from your 40 acres of rice land? He said, that can't be. And I said, well, how much land do you think an average person in an African village have? And I stumped him. He said, he don't know. I said, well, why, you know, they have about 1/4 of an acre, 2 acres. And they have it in different parts of the village. I said, when I was growing up as a child in the 60s, my parents were the suppliers of farm produce to the Caribbean. So they were supplying the Trinidad boats. And the village, I said, you know, this village that you're saying is lazy people, it was People were producing everything there. And my parents bought from them in the 60s, and also bought from East Indian farmers who had occupied lands in the new land settlement schemes. So when we think about Guyana and we think about food security, for the entire 19th century and for a lot of the 20th century, our food security, especially on the coast, depended on village production. You know, in preparing for this discourse today, what came to my mind was a Black woman by the name of Auntie Borta, who lived in the village next door to me. And I remembered, and I hope Mark is on this call, because Mark, I think this would be useful information for your work as you do your dissertation.
He is. Mark Chatterpaul.
Auntie Borta, I remembered that at Christmas time, going to Auntie Borta's house, she would feed us pepper pot, which is an Amerindian dish, yeah? So there was a relationship, there is a cross-breeding of our food systems. And cassava bread, that the African villagers were adept at making cassava bread. So at Christmas time, Auntie Borta would give me a meal of cassava bread and casserip. Now, I'm making that point because I know Mark's studies on cassava, because I could remember the Black village distinctly. That they, while they produce the 3-month, the variety with less starch, they also produce the 12-month and the 9-month, the variety with a lot of starch. And they also produce the bitter cassava, so they also knew how to process the bitter cassava in the African village to make casserip and to make the cassava bread. So there is a lot about our history that we need to capture, and we need to capture it not as East Indians, not as Africans, not as people who think that we did more to produce the country. We all contributed. Some of us contributed a lot, more than others, but we all contributed, and we have to engage this conversation together. You know, in preparing, I got a call from Guyana today by a colleague who I respect, a colleague from the East Indian community, and he said, Wazir, do you know what you're doing? Why are you engaged in this discussion at this time? That we have a lot of this discussion about who did more and who did less. I want to make it clear that my intervention is not about who did more and who did less. It's not about competition. We have to engage this history as a people and understand this history as a people. That is the legacy Walter Rodney left us with. You know, I got a boost in my work towards my PhD after I read, after Nigel passed me, a lecture that Walter Rodney gave in Binghamton in 1978, in which he said the duty of young people is to rewrite the history from the point of view of the working people, not from the point of view of Africans and not from the point of view of East Indians, from the point of view of all working peoples. Because whether we are indigenous, whether we are Africans, whether we're East Indians, we are all working people. We all came from villages in which we were made to fight against each other for absolutely no reason and no purpose. And so we have to use history as a tool to help us to recapture our humanity and ourselves. And so when Maya asked me to engage this discourse, I readily agreed, although we are in a period in which, you know, you're East Indian or you're African. We can't be in between anymore. That is what we have become, enemies of each other. Our job as intellectuals is to ensure that we fight for the truth.
Thanks, Wazir. I had one more slide. I see a question from Raquel, but I had one more slide on this, the rice farming, because in Forbes magazine, Forbes recently, Daphne Yuan Chow published a piece on gender and women farmers in Guyana and the potential for small-scale women farmers growing rice. And you raise this issue in terms of the size of land, that we don't have that many small-scale rice farmers anymore. And so
I wanted to know where the reporter got that information from, that there was any small, right? Look,
I'm not
Guyana,
sure. I think
Guyana, that's the problem of our country. The problem of our country is that after the 1989 compact with the IMF, I call it the compact with the IMF, because the economic program of all the political parties that were in power since 1989 has been the same. There's been no difference. They're all following the same playbook, the same ERP playbook that brought together that brought into being a new dispensation. What is that? What we have seen. Look, there are lots of, I can tell you that in 1956, there were like 22,000 small rice farmers, yeah, in the country. There are reports, but I haven't seen statistics is a hard thing to come by in Guyana. But there are reports that there were 45,000 small rice farmers in 1970. Probably maybe true, because you had all these land settlement schemes that came into being, yes? After the collapse of the Port Moran sugar estate in the 1950s and 1960s, the Black Bush scheme came into being. Yeah, people don't understand that these schemes came into being because of the collapse of sugar. Yeah, as sugar consolidated on the West Demerara, the Burasiri scheme came into being, and so all that land, the Burasiri Conservancy, all that land, backland behind the villages, going right up to the Maripa and the Bonasika Creek, right, came into being. I was a farmer in that region for a number of years. But what happened since 1989 was a gradual contraction of the number of small farmers. The number of small farmers basically, look, small rice farming began to become a thing again after 1990. And the reason for that was because of the concessionary rate for Guyana rice going into Europe, because of the quota that the European Union was giving to Guyana up to 1996. But then there was a second reason why what we saw was a stabilization of the number of small farmers between 1991 and 1996. And that had to do with what was called the other peoples and countries route into Europe, where these rice cartels operating out of Suriname, the Dutch colonies, Suriname, Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao, were buying rice from Guyana at high prices and exporting it into the European market through a back door as coming from within the European Union. Because remember, the Dutch colonies are still part of Europe. Yeah? Or were still part of Europe at that time. And so what you saw is a lot of people, many people got rich between 1991 and 1996. But then came the WTO in 1995, right? In which the European Union was required to do away with the quota system and they closed the loophole, the other countries and territories route loophole. So what we saw between 1990, and then pressure was put on CARICOM. You see, since 1900, the Caribbean market was the most secure market for Guyana's rice. From 1900 to 1996, the Caribbean market was the most secure market for Guyana's rice. But then pressure was put on CARICOM as a result of the WTO agreement to do away with a common external tariff where rice coming out from outside the region would have a tariff placed on it, which protected Guyana rice within CARICOM. As a result of what was going on within CARICOM between 1996 and 2000, the Caribbean market became uncertain. It is within that uncertainty that the rice farming sector began to contract in ways that we had not seen before. What saved the rice industry in that was the Venezuelan market. But by that time, most of the people with small holdings, with small plots on the West Demerara, on the East Coast, and on the Quarantine, and West Berbice, had already begun to rent out their holdings to large farmers. This affected the villages in, look, this has affected the culture of the rural communities. I tried to explain this in 2 lectures I gave. One, in 2009, when I spoke at the National Rice Conference at the Artachon Convention Center. And again, in 2015, when I spoke at the National Rice Conference at the same center, invited by both governments. But we have done nothing, no kind of social engineering. I raised the question of social engineering with the former Minister of Agriculture. We had a long chat about it and about how we can engage it, how we can employ researchers to do it. But you know, in Guyana, there is no attention. Social scientists don't matter anymore. The only country in the world where social science does not matter. You see? And so what we have today, Maya, is the only part of the country where there are real small rice farmers are on the Essequibo coast. Yeah? There's still small rice farmers on the Essequibo coast itself. And you can see from the figures you have up on the screen. Yeah? And I know a lot of these farmers. I've dwelt with them. I talk with them. You know, I go among them. I do research among them. But let me just say one other thing in relationship to this. See, as I said at the beginning, Guyana's history is not a blank slate. Coming out of 1898, what developed across the country were feudal estates. And so what we are seeing today in a number of areas, especially on the Essequibo coast, is semi-feudal relations, where the small farmers depend on capital and are tied to the big millers and the big farmers in ways that is reminiscent of the feudal period. Yeah? Look, there is a lot of research to be done, but the problem that we have is that we don't have an institution in Guyana that is dedicated to doing any research. And I'm hopeful that the University of Guyana will catch its breath and become an institution like it was in the 60s and the 70s and the early 80s, and that we could begin to do the kind of social research. But for them to do that, the University of Guyana will have to give equal weight to the social sciences as it gives to the so-called STEM areas. Because in a country like Guyana, we need all the sciences.
Hair to that, Wazir. And as someone who is in the STEM, that's exactly what we're grappling with now, which is another reason that I thought this was appropriate, teaching in the US and being Black. There's a lot of, you know, like what would our lives, what would anywhere look like if Black lives did matter? And the same thing I think you could think of for Guyana. If Black lives mattered, would we have that coastline built on slave labor? And so it's rethinking the way in which we design our cities. In the US, a lot of the infrastructure, wastewater, all those sorts of things end up in, you know, lands that are lower lands, potentially lands where Blacks lived or live. And they do so with all this environmental hazard. And so would we have developed wastewater treatment plants like that if everybody mattered? Or would we have, you know, had that septic at the house that was totally efficient? And that would be the way in which our cities were built. And so I think it's going back to this history and really learning your sort of how things developed. And I think people are interested in learning that now, so that you could pretty much, they're using a term to decolonize like all the different fields that we're in. And so there is synergy, I think, in terms of many different disciplines.
I use another term, Maya. We have to use history to humanize politics.
Humanize,
to
yeah.
humanize development. Look, I live in the Midwest, the middle part of the United States. And I drive through the farming areas all the time. I mean, you know, I told Guyana the other day, I was calling him and laughing because I had just come from a farm where you could actually go and collect Creole eggs. You collect your eggs, you make your change, you leave your money. Yeah? And I live in a part of the country where that kind of humanity exists. I live in a part of the country where people plant vegetables in the spring and in the summer months, and in households they can these vegetables. Yeah. Now we have access to all this technology. Yeah, and we could transfer it and we could humanize so that we could empower our communities in order to create development. Yeah, we can't create development. The people have to create development. We have to give them the tool, and history has to be used as a tool through which that they can do that. So I would use the term humanize.
Humanize is great. And I see people have questions, so you guys could just unmute and jump in. And I wanted to show the images. Just 1 second. I just want
sure.
to, you know, you're seeing activity in some villages where, like, this is the Buxton Friendship Museum. And I saw a recent posting about, you know, doing small scale farming. It was a two-day farmers market that they had. And so I think there probably is a lot of interest, especially, hopefully there's lots of discussion now with COVID-19 as people think about where they get their food from and whether you could be at least self-sufficient in a smaller area. And it may not be a monocrop like rice, right? We need to be growing multiple different foods at the same time in a small space.
You have to have an explosion of crops. And that is why the sugar lands have to be discussed.
Yeah.
Because there have to be an explosion of ownership and an explosion of crops. And we have to look, the sugar industry, the sugar lands have to be democratized. Let me put it that way. Agriculture itself has to be democratized. I mean, I like what's happening in Buxton. But imagine if what is happening in Buxton was joined in a discursive, educational manner where Clonbrook, young farmers in Clonbrook and Helena, yeah, in Mahaika, could share their knowledge in a field day with Buxton farmers, and they could exchange ideas and information. You see, we have to go somewhere with this thing. And doing this stuff in Buxton, yes, it's good that this is happening, yeah? But we have to take it to the next level because expertise has to be shared. And there's so much that farmers have learned. Farmers in Perikabak Dam could teach the people coming out of the Guyana School of Agriculture stuff that they don't know. You see? But how do we collect that pool of information? How do the people make use of that information and be able to use it among themselves?
Somebody had a question?
I had a question.
Go ahead.
This is Disa. Related to the term humanize, I just wanted to get back to it for a little bit because I've recently really been trying to not use that word when we're talking about systems related to people, like politics, where you are, where you're essentially talking about oppression and how marginalized people have been oppressed historically and in contemporary times, because I think it's like it sort of connotes that one group in that relationship has not been fully human, and I you know, it's like I feel like the oppressed don't need to be humanized. They need to have their humanity acknowledged. And so I've been trying to think of, and I by no means have come up with the correct construct for it, but think of it in terms of equalizing or in terms of systems of equity. And so I just wanted to just drop that and see if anybody has any thoughts on it. I haven't, this is not a fully formed thought. It's just something that, especially in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, and you're hearing a lot that word humanize, that's been really striking for me.
Actually, on Friday, I was using the term for humanistic engineering and so on, and then we changed it to inclusive. I think probably because of that.
Let me explain why I use the term. Because I'm from the countryside, yeah? I mean, I'm a country person for all intents and purposes. And we deal with modern water. Yeah, I grew up in modern water. I grew up planting rice in the way you would see people planting rice with their hand. So when I say humanize, I mean, I don't mean that the people have to be humanized, yeah? I mean, the systems have to be humanized. I mean, government have to be humanized so that the people become empowered in that process. In 1989, I was still in Guyana. My village became flooded because the sea dam was blown away by the Atlantic. So our village was flooded. The African village next door was flooded. And so we walked across to the African village and we collected ourselves in groups of people in some pickup trucks, and we went to the regional chairman. And we got there about 4 o'clock the afternoon. He was dressing to go meet with the president. At that time, the president was Mr. Hoyt. And we walked into his office. And he said, "What are you guys doing here?" And so we said, "You're coming with us." Just like that. We didn't say why we said, "You're coming with us." He said, no, I'm going to meet with the president. I said, "No, you're coming with us. Because if you don't come with us, then the next thing you have to do is to bring the army out, because we will bring both villages and take over this compound and this office." So he came down with us. And then I asked him to step into the water, and the water was like waist high for me. And I said to him when he was in the water, "Well, now we can talk about what demands we have." And he said, "So what do you guys want?" I said, "Well, number one, we don't want to see your engineer. We want your engineer to leave here, because the only thing your engineer knows is steel. and that we can't depend on your engineers to seal the breach. And we need you, because government is supposed to be about the people. And so the resources that you manage really belongs to us. And so our demand to you is to hand those resources over to the community. Machinery and everything, all the raw materials that we needed. He said, can't do that. I said, well, we will take over your office and you will have to bring the army. So we agreed. And he handed the resources over to us. And we worked together as a people. And we sealed the breach within 12 hours. Now, when I talk about humanizing, I mean humanizing this thing, this system that is called government. What we have, the government itself, the systems itself, has come with the colonial baggage, with the overseering baggage, with this history of oppression. I remember another occasion when Minister Mackenzie was the Minister of Agriculture, and he came to speak to us because they wanted to recite the facade that was the main drainage canal, came to meet with the communities. And the engineers were making their arguments as to why they wanted to recite the canals. And we got up and we opposed it. And we opposed it, and we said to the minister, we said, look, you come from modern water like us. That we understand the movement of water in these communities more than your engineers. And your engineers have not come to us to discuss design. So that's when I talk about humanizing, that is what I mean. And I have one more example, Maya. After the Carter Center came into Guyana for the '92 elections, and they remained. And I was very close, I worked very closely on behalf of the opposition with the Carter Center, both before, during, and after the elections. And they called me after the elections to say that they were sending in a team to write the development plan for Guyana. Imagine that. Imagine that monstrosity. And I laughed. So they asked me to have lunch with the team, and I had lunch with the team, and they told me what their plans were, and I said, you guys have got to be crazy. You got to be kidding me. I said, how can you write a development plan without listening to the people? They said it will take too long to go around the country and listen to people. And here we are. Here we are, 20 years after, 18 years after. We have the Water Users Association that replaced the Drainage and Irrigation Board. We have less drainage and irrigation in the communities, right? So when I talk about humanizing, that is what I mean. I mean humanizing the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, the IMF, the Canadian International Development Agency, the American aid. We have to carry this discussion to them, or else we're not going to have any change and any development.
Well, thanks for that, Wazir. I think there's, you know, even the banks now are requiring more in terms of stakeholder engagement, or being taken to task on what they do in terms of stakeholder engagement, in terms of identifying, first of all, even figuring out what the problem is and then what the solutions might be. And so hopefully you're seeing a change in fields. You talk a lot about engineers, and I think in engineering, there's a lot more talk about community engaged work, where you're co-creating with communities versus designing in a lab and never really knowing the context or the people with whom you should be working. Somebody, Mark had his, wanted to ask a question, so I'm just gonna ask him to unmute and ask.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
We can see your face, Mark.
The video is not allowing me to turn on.
Oh, let me find you in there.
People need to know you, bro.
You could turn your video on, Mark.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Was there my great presentation? I have two specific questions. The first is in relation to cassava production by freed Afro peoples or liberated Afro peoples. Are there any literature documenting specific crop varieties or anything to that extent? Or looking at the connections between the sharing of genetic resources between indigenous peoples and Afro peoples in relation to that crop? And then the second question is a little more oriented towards the decision of land utilization, referring back to your slide of the dams, the land spots being redesignated into thousands of houses. Yes, that one there. Is there any work focusing on the decision-making process of peoples that influence their thought process as to why certain spots of land were left, just they opted not to use it or utilize it? There was a decision, that collective decision. I'm more curious about why those decisions were made and if there's anything being written about it. But thanks for your time, and hi guys, everyone.
The issue of knowledge, you might want to check out the work of A.R.F. Weber. I heard Guyana was asked the same question in a webinar that he was involved with this week, and that was the answer that he gave. I have, and Nigel may be able to help too, Nigel is on this call. I do have a piece of work by A.R.F. Weber that I could share with you. And I could go through it, but you know, that's the, I mean, you might also want to look at the works of Schomburg, yeah? And in terms of what was happening in the villages, if you, and one of the reasons that I encourage you to go to the archives at Kew Gardens in England is because you might want to look at the report of the magistrates. You know, there were these magistrates that were going into the villages to see what was happening in the 1840s and to give detailed reports. I have a box of material here in which I still have to read.
I think we can always have that conversation about those materials,
yeah,
separate.
but then,
and there is no way I'm going to the UK at this point in time.
You might want to check with Nari and those places, because remember, Guyana had, when I was a child, Guyana had a system of outreach of an agricultural officer who was designated, who was in charge of each area, and they were actually living in the communities. Yeah. So for my area, I come from East Bank Essequibo. There was a house at Virginujan, a government compound at Virginujan, in which an agriculture field officer was living there. And if a farmer in farm needed access to that agriculture field officer, he would tie a piece of canicro bush on a pole at the roadside in front of his house, and the field officer would stop there to find out what his problem was. Yeah? So there would be, I don't know if there's any record of any of this, yeah, at the Guyana School of Agriculture or at UG, or even in the Guyana archives. What I can tell you is that when you
come down from there, come.
And he has to look after his child. When you come to land utilization, the reason that you find in the African villages, they set aside these land because they were thinking far ahead. They were thinking about industrialization, space that they could have to set up processing plants, yes, and stuff like that, to keep those lands so that when the as the country, as situation evolved, that they can take those decisions, yeah? And that is why they left those lands available. Now that you have raised the question of varieties and stuff, let me just make this side point, Maya, and that's on the question of plantains. Walter Rodney in his book talked about the moko disease, which affected the plantain crop, and that had to do when a place was not properly drained or when the soil was sour. Mark would know what I'm talking about, yeah? And that the African population in planting plantains developed the know-how and the knowledge on how not to plant a disease sucker. And if they came across with a disease sucker, they had that knowledge how to clean their implement, their cutlasses and their shovels to ensure that they did not transfer the disease to another plant. They knew how to contain the disease on their own farms. And that knowledge was also transferred across board. I don't know how much of it was transferred into the indigenous communities, Mark, but I certainly know that that knowledge was transferred to the Indian community because I was a plantain farmer myself, right? I learned that from Peter and Johnson and Mackenzie, right? My father learned that from his friends. So, I mean, so there is a lot of knowledge there that have to be recaptured, and that's the point. I hope, Dessa, I hope I answered your question.
Can I ask a question? And I know other people had written questions, but rather than me reading, if you just also unmute your mic and ask, I think it's Raquel and Nicholas also. But in terms of thinking of ways in which to, you know, process, like to sort of kind of formalize that innovation that is bringing together people to look at the historical record and also think about how you prepare for the future. How much is that happening within, like, how does that happen outside of government? Because we've seen government failed over and over again to do this. So how does it happen outside of government? When I drive through on the you know, the main East Coast or all those roads, it's sort of like a little overwhelming on just how low the population density is and how vast the land is. And so how do you actually take all the resources, whether in Guyana or outside, who may be tied to a certain village? I do think the folks in town, in Georgetown, are completely sort of in many cases disconnected from this type of discussion because we have no concept of village life. And for some of us, we have no family that we're, you know, that we would have gone to be a part of that. And so is there a way to sort of rethink that land? I don't know who owns the, you know, a lot, I guess it's a lot of private ownership now, but how do you buy some of that and start to develop these more innovative, inclusive spaces to document this stuff and think about what the future looks like when you might have more intense rainfall. We might have, I can't remember for Guyana if it's more, you know, periods of drought and then lots more intense rainfall periods. But what does that mean for the kind of agriculture that we would produce, especially if you're saying it's also linked to disease and knowing how to combat it? It's linked to the type of different cassava species and knowing which one would survive in a drought year or probably a wet year. I didn't even know that, you know, this concept of casroot making on the coast versus.
It's also, when you talk about cassava, it's
Can
also,
I just,
go ahead. Go ahead.
hi, this is Elisa. Hi, Wazir. Hi, everybody. I wanted to just, in terms of what Maya asked, I wondered if we could sort of deepen that question, Wazir, and ask you to sort of historicize it slightly. AUC was actually on a panel last week, and I've approached the organizers to ask them if they could bring him back for a one-on-one where some of us could actually ask him questions, because there was so much detail that got left out because he was just one of a number of panelists and it skipped over the historical part really swiftly. But I wondered, in terms of thinking about what Maya's asked you about, where that knowledge went and stuff, if you could perhaps reflect on some of the, you know, AUC often talks about the earliest sort of experiments in post-emancipation democracy took place at a village level. And so I wondered if you could sort of reflect for the panel, and maybe we could think about, you know, getting Uncle AUC back onto our conversation precisely about that. Talk about some of those earlier experiments at village democracy, because what we've seen in, or what we see in contemporary Guyana, the way in which regional democratic councils and all of those things work, is completely antithetical to the kinds of organic ways in which villages participated, both within villages and across villages, which, you know, the evidence for that is at the height of the anti-colonial movement. It was, for example, to Buxton that someone like Chetty Jagan would go to begin to sort of mobilize and to recruit folks in the anti-colonial struggle that would lead to the victory for the PPP in 1953. So I wondered if you could perhaps reflect on some of those, what AUC refers to as those earliest experiments of democracy actually taking place at the village level. That's where participation actually sort of occurs, and where we see that kind of efflorescence that then becomes, you know, through the, you know, becomes, you know, taken away, whittled away, that power moving to central government and then becoming so politicized in ways that are antithetical to village development today.
Yeah, well, Alyssa, on that note, on the last point, I want to, let me just tell, and this is a very old copy of a book by Alan Young called Approaches to Local Self-Government in British Guyana. Because the early local government and the real idea of village government was actually developed in the first villages in the country, in which they formulated how these villages should be run, how rates and taxes should be paid, how the drains, both drainage and irrigation canals should be cleaned, how the dams should be kept, and stuff like that, that they developed that kind of management. But that kind of management, remember, these villages that we're talking about were not exclusively African villages. They began as exclusively African villages in the in the first decade of emancipation. Yeah? But then as indentured servants became free, a number of them bought lands in those villages, and a number of the villages were multiracial villages. So you actually had villages in which East Indians and Africans were participating in producing what we now call local government democracy, that was then re-engineered in the 1970s to create the neighborhoods within which the village falls. Now, UC and others, myself included, Nigel, etc., have always called for return to the village councils, because it is only the village knows what it needs. I mean, my village of Lady Stain would know what Lady Stain needs, yeah? The village of Farm next door would know what Farm needs. There is no reason we can't discuss those things. But in a situation where local government is politicized, then one party controls a neighborhood that have an African village, or one party controls a neighborhood that have an Indian village. And so what happens is that there is a kind of paramountcy relation that develops. What we have to move back to is a process whereby the village can be expected to take care of its own affairs in terms of the health of the village. Drainage and irrigation is paramount with the help of central government. Yeah, these things are very important. So the question of, we should ask ourselves in this conversation. So if these villages were multiracial, from about 1855, when did they stop being multiracial? I mean, as a child, I remember that the rum shop in the village next door to me, which is a farm village, this is African village, was owned by a man named Sitaram. The only Saul goods shop in the whole area was owned by the Hussein family, and that Saul goods shop was in that village, farm village. What happened in the 60s was the movement away of these people from those villages. Now, a lot of these people continue to have plots of land in those villages. So although some East Indians have left those villages, they continue to have plots of lands in those villages, in many areas. Look, the point I'm making, look, we can't solve the issue in one conversation, and I don't know we can solve it in many conversations. But we have to begin to solve the issue. And the solution to the issue lies in teaching in a people's history, evolving. The closest I see that in the Caribbean is the work that is being done in Jamaica right now by Vivian Shepherd, who has taken history to the communities and does a program called Teaching History, right? What we need is a national people's history project in which the history of each community is told within those communities, not outside of those communities. I mean, people in my village did not know, or young people growing up don't know that it was a French estate and then it became a Dutch estate. And as a child, we would dig and find the foundation of the factory. And then we would dig up those clay bricks and use it in the yard. And people don't know this kind of stuff. But we have to have, probably such a thing can be done through the university, but that would mean strengthening the history program at the University of Guyana, and in which a number of us participate, either by going home or as international adjuncts or in some form. But we have to, Alyssa, I guess this does not answer your question, but.
Hello, Maya.
Yes, Melissa, you want to ask a question? Melissa? Melissa?
Yeah, I think somebody's
Yes.
saying hello, Maya. Just go
Sorry.
ahead.
I wasn't hearing you, Wazir, so I thought you had finished speaking. So, yeah, when you're finished, if I can jump in here just on this very specific question.
Right. Go ahead.
That Lisa asked.
I like when people jump in. Go ahead. Melissa?
All right. So, Maya, please don't put on my video. Thank you. Yeah, so on the question of the early village movement, Wazir, I think the time that you're talking about in terms of the mixing of villages came a little later. Yeah. Because I think what Alyssa is getting at is that the early village movement came under a more or less cooperative management system. There was a committee of management that was elected in each village, and each village had a chairman, a vice chairman, a treasurer, a secretary, and then they organized so that they were an additional 7 committee members. And it was these acknowledged village leaders elected from amongst the purchasers of the village. And here we're talking about the immediate post-emancipation period and the formation of the African villages, who would have exercised authority that flowed through a mutual voluntary agreement. And within the village, villages would pledge to carry out the vital works to ensure that, of course, you know, the plantation function, well, their estates, the villages functioned as they ought to function. So what we find is that local government at this very early stage was at its best a community working in action, and it was adopted very quickly in the communal villages because, of course, the nature of that particular village where the people who resided in the village and who owned the village had joined and pooled together to purchase the villages. But very importantly as well, to some extent, the system of village administration was then adopted in the proprietary villages. So those villages where people bought individual plots of lands in the post-emancipation period, they also adopted a similar structure. So administration of the villages came under the village management committees or village management councils, and it worked well in the initial instances. But of course, as we know, with the village movement itself, there were a number of problems and challenges that actually hindered the system. Foremost among them, of course, was the plan to hostility, and the fear that the success of the villages would actually undermine the continued economic and social and political dominance of the planter class. And so there were a number of things that, you know, we can discuss, but I don't want to get into. But the question as it relates to the village administration itself, this village administration that was established, the kernel of it, the kernel of our local government system comes from the structure that was set up in the early years. And as problems emerged in the early years, of the village movement, and as problems emerged in terms of city fences, boulders, drainage and irrigation, infrastructural works, health, etc., in the villages, and these committees, of course, being unable to secure any kind of credit to advance and improve their structures, were, after a while, could not solve the environmental problems and constraints that they found themselves in the villages. And so it was at that stage that central government used their inability to environmentally manage the communal property, not necessarily their individual ones, but a communal one. And of course, some of the legal challenges that emerge in terms of land ownership as a pretext to interfere in the village affairs and then ultimately take control. So we see from around the 1860s going into the 1870s increased political control of the villages. But up to that point, the villages were essentially under African management and control in terms of the community management councils and the community management committees. So I just wanted to stick that because I think that is, well, the root of what Alyssa was trying to get at.
I just want to ask you a question, Melissa, because can you, for the audience, explain the difference between the proprietary and the communal villages?
Right. So the communal villages were those that were purchased on a group basis. The cost of land in many instances was outside the reach of the individual African villager. But what they could do was pool their resources and purchase lands as groups. And so they purchased entire villages as groups, pooled their resources and purchased villages as groups. I think it was R.T. Smith who talked about the social and cultural impetus behind the formation of villages. So whereas, I mean, there is a lot of tendency for us to look at this as an effort at economic independence, as an effort at, you know, in a sense, political independence, because they will be ruling themselves with this fear of a village. At the same time, R.T. Smith pointed to the relationship between this communal way of living that Akan people in West Africa would have utilized, and the way in which that communal way of living was likely transferred into this group purchase of land. So the communal villages were just those villages that were purchased by groups. And then you had the proprietary villages. Those villages were planters in many instances, or in some instances, in one particular instance, notable instance with one African man who bought land, subdivided it, and then sold individual plots. And so that was the difference between the two, where the first instance, the land was bought as a group, and in other instances, individuals bought plots of land. And that really, the group purchase of land really identifies, I suppose, in a sense, a communal way of managing. Because when they bought the group's land, they did a number of things. They had the lands that were designated as housing lands, meaning here we would build our home. And then they had the lands designated as farmlands, so we call the back dam, which is, and those lands were where they actually farmed. And then they also identified common spaces like, you know, for schools and for playgrounds and for, you know, their community center. And so some common spaces that were purchased by all of those villagers who bought that entire estate, which were not designated or were not assigned to specific families because they were supposed to be for the purpose of the community. And that has now emerged as something that is problematic because, of course, if the authority of the village resides outside of the village, then someone from outside of the village could determine what happens to those common lands that are essentially lands that had been bought by the villagers. This did not happen, of course, in the proprietary villages because it was the proprietor in those villages that would determine, well, whether I'm going to set up a playground or whether I'm going to designate this area for schools, etc. So that is the main difference between the two.
I see Charlene's hand, Maya.
Oh yeah, Charlene, just unmute.
Okay, I actually was writing the question to Melissa privately, but you spotted my hand. I just wanted to know if you could rattle off the names of some of those villages that developed differently, the communal villages as opposed to the other type. I didn't get the name.
Proprietary.
Proprietary, right, sorry. Could you give us a few examples of those two differences in villages as we've inherited them?
Yes. So Victoria was the first of the communal villages. This was purchased in 1839, and by 1840, you had 4 additional communal villages. The west coast of Berbice, there was Golden Grove, there was St. John's, the east half of Perseverance, Litchfield. Just to kind of give you a sense, Golden Grove was 500 acres. It was purchased by 14 laborers. St. John's was 252 acres, purchased by 46. Africans Eats, the east half of Perseverance was 250 acres. That was purchased by 109 laborers. And then there was Litchfield, which was 500 acres and was actually purchased, as I said, this is the one I want to remember. So I'm glad that I was able to find it quickly. Somehow I figured somebody would have asked this question. And Cujo McPherson actually purchased that entire 500 acres, and then he divided it up and sold the individual plots of land. So he's in fact our first developer. The proprietary villages, some of them were Plitanka, Zweed Holland, Zweed Andit, Three Sisters. Yeah, so those are the earlier purchases of communal versus proprietary.
Three Friends.
Yeah, it's good to know this stuff, and for young students to, as Wazir was suggesting, that we bring the university close to our students, getting to understand their realities, you know.
Melissa raised the question.
Those histories.
Yeah, another important communal village is Buxton. As I said, all of the proprietary villages were ultimately converted all the communal villages were eventually converted into proprietary villages, where problems started to emerge when you talk about what you call children's property. So you have, let's say, 80 initial purchasers of villages. These individuals die and have 4 children. So of these 80 original purchasers, each one had a 1/80th share, right, of the entire village. But as that individual died, that individual had 4 children, or that individual had 6 children or 2 children. Then there was further subdivision of the property. In some instances, some members of the family left. In some instances, some members, but because of the whole question of ancestral inheritance or the whole question of lineage and connection through the ages, after a while, what happened was that with these children's property, nobody really knew where the ownership lay. No one could figure it out because of just the strands of what do you call them? Sorry. Not ancestors. Inheritors, right? Nobody really knew the strands. And after a while, those people who knew that there were many instances, who knew that these lands belonged to, for instance, their mother or their grandmother, then started to make claim for their portions of the land. And so that's a lot of the farmlands became uneconomical because the portions allotted to individuals for development became smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And of course, now we know about shade houses, and we know about, building up in terms of structuring our agricultural systems and processes. But, during that time, the whole question of scale was connected to, the amount of land that you actually had. And so after a while, they became uneconomical. But the first conversion of a communal village to a proprietary village was Buxton, and that happened in 1851.
So now you can see why I put up the map of Buxton. Imagine what Melissa is talking about, and the further subdivisions of those little parcels. Now, this is why when I made my presentation to the Lands Commission, I told them that, look, to address the problems that have arisen, the problem that are arising, the problem that will arise, that the Lands Commission needs to be permanent and needs to be problem solving rather than having individuals going to the courts, incurring fees that they cannot afford, and lawyers' fees and all of that. That what was needed was a way in which government needs to intervene to ensure these problems can be dealt with at the communal level. There is another reason why that is so. In 2006, I went to see a former commissioner of lands, I wouldn't name him here, and I said to him, I wanted to talk to him about what was happening, and he said, if you're coming to me as a politician, you will have to leave. But if you're coming to me as a researcher, then it's okay. So I said, look, I was doing research and I wanted to know what he was involved with now. And he said simply, he said, Wazir, I spend my time hanging out at the High Court. I said, doing what? He said, because I have the knowledge and I'm trying to save poor people from losing their land because of the amount of land theft that is occurring all across the country, both in and out of the African villages. And a lot of it is mostly outside of the African villages. The African villages have their own issues of inheritance and all of that creates bottlenecks, which have to be addressed. But then the land thefts outside the African villages are more than the land thefts within the Indian villages, within the African villages. One other point, because Melissa raised the question of West African know-how in relationship to the politics of the villages. Look, there was West African know-how, not only in relationship to the organizing of the villages. There were West African know-how in relationship to poldering, in relationship to drainage and irrigation. The enslaved were not empty vessels. They understood modern water as, and you know, the closest you can come to this kind of discourse is the work of Judith Carney, who wrote a book called Black Rice, or with grains in her hair, and stuff like that, in which what she zeroes in on is the fact that people were recruited and enslaved, not only because they were available to be sold, but because of their knowledge. And that knowledge was brought to bear and put to bear in the colonies.
Thanks, Wazir. Nicholas, you want to ask a question? Just unmute yourself.
Hi, Dr. Trotz. Thank you so much for facilitating this art of discussion, first of all. And my first question has to do with the planting of rice and other subsistence crops. In more contemporary times, there was the establishment of the MMA, ADA, the Maiconia-Barry Agricultural Development Authority. And I'd like to know what role it had to play in supporting farmers from the Maico-Maiconi district, and or if it was an authority that sort of stymied their further growth and development by creating a whole new political dynamic on an already existing ancestral dynamic. My second question has to do, we always talk a lot about ancestral and colonial experiences regarding economics or regarding access to land. But as a medical student, I'm a final year medical student, and I always wonder what was the impact of the plantation structure on the health of the persons, because generally, no matter what you have, you can't have maximum productivity if you have an unhealthy population. So I'd like to know if you have any information regarding like how the plantation system impacted the health of the emancipated and indentured laborers.
In relationship to the question you asked about the MMA, the MMA was one of the schemes that was developed to ensure that more land became accessible. The MMA is a drainage and irrigation scheme to take in lands that were behind the existing villages, lands that were like in the savanna areas, to empower more lands so that more lands can be brought into agriculture. Like everything else, the MMA scheme became a scheme that favored the upper classes in the society, that favored those who had enough land to expand their holdings. Because of course you need capital to work these lands. With the collapse of the agricultural bank and the collapse of the Rice Development Corporation, the Rice Development Corporation was established so that there was something that resembled a machinery pool that had machineries, combined tractors, sprayers, all these different things in different areas of the country that can be accessed by small farmers. And the Rice Development Scheme, the Rice Development Corporation, existed until the late 1970s. Because a small farmer could have gone and rented a tractor to plow his 2-acre, and in order to plant rice. With the disappearance of these machinery pools, it became very difficult for small farmers to access machinery. Guyana had all these systems. You had the credit cooperation, in which a farmer could go down and say, I need $1,000 to buy fertilizer for my crop. And the state had an agency in the community that could lend the farmer that money, and the farmer would pay it back at the end of the crop. And then you had the Guyana, the Guy Bank, right? That was available to also lend farmers I could remember, I could remember farmers that I know who got small, you know, the Kubota tractors, not the four-wheel drive, the one that that propels itself, in which they were able to give farmers the facilities of capital in order to get those things. So we have to understand that the MMA scheme could have been beneficial to the villagers if the villagers were able to expand their cultivation into that scheme. But in order to do that, they had to be able to access the necessary capital to do it, or machinery. At the same time that these processes were expanding, these systems began to collapse. And so what evolved is the way in which the man with the machinery who can work the land is now able to occupy more lands. I mean, you may call it grabbing. I don't call it that. I call it an evolution, the way capital works. Yeah? Because you don't have a government that is capable of understanding the sociology of the communities, to understand how development needs to expand at the household level by providing the necessary facilities. And as these systems collapse, this is why we need an agricultural bank that can lend small people money. That is why we need machinery pool. We don't need every farmer to have a tractor. A tractor lays idle for most of the year. But if a tractor can work, can do 100 2-acre blocks, then every farmer would be able to produce. But if a farmer operating in a rice area where there is flooding, there is drainage and irrigation, the possibility of flooding, then only rice can grow there. And so the farmer, the man with the 2-acre or quarter-acre, is then forced by circumstance to rent his land to the man with the machinery and the man with capital. And so the contraction in the number of small farmers in the rice industry occurred between 1996 and now because of that. I mean, if you look at the area from number 52 to number 74 on the quarantine, you see exactly what I'm saying. You look at Virgin Eugene, you see exactly what I'm saying. You look at Philadelphia, you look at Greenwich Park, you look at Farm, you look at Ruby, you look at Lady Stain, you see exactly what I'm saying. That these villages where 50 or 100 farmers would have been farming the land in a village is now being farmed by 1 or 2 persons because they have the machinery and they're renting the land. On the question of impact of the
Sorry, Wazir, question. Let's say you have the machinery, because we are going to a world that's going to be more automated. So let's say for somehow I bought land. All the villages pool and I bought the land, and I can walk into a bank and get a loan. Mark is saying you need a low interest rate loan. So I got the loan for machinery, and somebody developed sort of a drone that could come. I don't know if a drone could do it, but I could imagine it could throw darts into the soil. And so instead of people going through planting the rice, it's just me operating a little, you know, instrument that could plant the whole place in less than a day. And so how do you tool? How do we tool for that?
I proposed when I met the Minister of Agriculture in 2015 that we should develop a research unit in the Ministry of Agriculture that could think about social engineering of the communities where the small farmers remain, but that we engage in what we could call block planting. Yeah? Where everybody plants together, right? So if you have an aircraft to fertilize, then you fertilize all together. You have an aircraft to spray, then you spray all together. But then you're controlling water in a better way, yeah? You can make more money because then you're all you're not suffering from pests coming from somebody else's plot. Yeah? That you can have more control. Look, there are systems that can be implemented if we want to do it. Problem is that we don't want to do it. In the 1970s, we had rice silos that was state-owned, in which any small farmer who has reaped 50 bags of paddy takes his crop to the silo, sells it immediately, gets his money, go back to his farm. Under the neoliberal program, these silos were sold out, right? We began to face hardships. As a rice farmer, I faced hardships. We climbed the silo at Ramzek, a farmer by the name of Bobby Ganga Pasad from Hague. Because of the hardships farmers were facing, we climbed that silo in the late 1970s to stop the operation, to force government to intervene on the behalf of farmers. Because they had sold the silo to an entity, yeah, a private entity, and they were just doing, and they continue to do whatever they want. You see, part of our problem is privatization of processing, right? We could have, why don't we have public entities that are in charge of processing, of grain collection, of grain buying, of grain distribution? Modern countries have done this. Europe has developed mechanisms to protect its small farmers against the onslaught of neoliberal practices. Why can't we do it?
Well, I know, I mean, for many of the small farmers in Guyana, in terms of getting funding to do the processing, is, you know, they're just not being able to access the funding, the loans for it, and not even trying to go through government. It's like if you just don't get access to the loans. Mark wanted to respond to your point. Go ahead, Mark.
I think also when it comes to the question of mechanization, it's also a question of scale. And also specific crop requirements. So for example, some of the work I'm doing is looking at how mechanized cassava harvesting by these machines that are being developed in China is rapidly being used for large scale mega farming of roots and tubers. And so what would be considered a tool that could be used to alleviate the intensive labor practices of small farmers is also interchangeable for large scale monocropping. So I think we also need to, when we examine those questions, is also to examine the question of scale and crop specificity.
Yeah, we've been going for 2 hours, and so I think, you know, we should think of having someone present next time, but to also continue the discussion. I think there've been comments about being able to share and learn this history. This whole thing came up because I asked a question, or I raised a point in a chat with my sister, and she's sort of like in sort of not even just kind of amazed that I didn't know some of the history. And I was like, well, you know, there are people who have this knowledge, and there are definitely generations of Guyanese that don't know it. We have technology now where you could zoom in and out of places and look at places, where we can hear voices from people, where we can collect information, learn from each other. And so it's probably time that we do more of this. We have the university faculty on here. There are ways in which hopefully there are ways that you could you know, engage and build this stuff up so that it's not just about, you know, training students for the petroleum industry. I think what Guyanese need now is sort of to like dig deep and go back and learn about the villages. For those of us who grew up in the city, it's sort of, you know, students came in from the villages to the schools in the city, and we never really went out. And so how do you you know, empower like every village school, every school to be that resource that maybe could collect all of this information and could be the innovation space to look at the agriculture and the innovation there. And if there are groups that, you know, I see like the Buxton Museum, you know, how do we support those places? I don't know if Kofi's still on here, but I'm sure there are young Guyanese looking at ways in which they can re-engage and re-enter the villages where they grew up. And then the question is, how do they bring others along, especially those of us who are not from those places? As someone in the city, like, I don't want to live in a city anymore, you know? And I think there are probably many people, as we deal with COVID-19, who really think, like, where do you go to live? We could be virtual, so where would you go? Would I come back home to Guyana, or would I go somewhere else? And what would that take if that were to happen? So thank you so much for this, Wazir. And I think we should just continue this. I know Lena and Vidya do a chat also, and they have one going tomorrow. I recorded this, but there should be some way in which we collect the you know, these things and share it in a more to wider audience across, you know, so that young Guyanese especially get to see stuff and learn from this and document it and share it. And the reality is lots of this land is being bought out and developed. So the idea of having small scale farmers is probably, you know, we need to act sooner than later.
But if we don't act, then a large part of Guyana will disappear. And a large part of our culture will disappear, because the rural culture is about small farming. It's organized around crops and small farming. And so we can see a large sector of Guyana disappearing if we don't help to retool the public space.
I'm burning to share a little something. May I?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I saw a vision for the university playing a really important part of this. So last year, was it the year before, I took a group of students, 17 students, who had to raise their own money because we were not allowed to use the student facilities fee. I took them to the village of Wakapau, where the Guyanese Languages Unit has started a language revitalization initiative. And the students were transformed by that experience. It was just a long Easter weekend. One child sat in Priest Jones' compound, and he asked me to let him stay 2 more weeks. Another parent reported that when her son came back home, he was so transformed that he was doing things differently in the house, that things that she used to want him to do, but he wasn't willing to do. And one student actually made a video, which I had one of the Locono speakers write over and do a voiceover in Locono. But I mean, money has to be spent to get our young people to know their country. So this is where policy becomes really important. We had to beg and borrow and all kind of thing to get there. So money has to be spent for that initiative to happen.
For sure. I don't know if Raquel is on.
Yes.
She talks about taking students, I think, to Iwakrama also. And I know at the university it's been talked to about how does UG have satellite centers around the country where there could also be more exchange.
Yes.
So,
I agree with Charlene. It's something I really believe in, and I think it transforms lives. It also is a way to actually encourage, I don't know if some people don't like this word, but patriotism and nation building. It's encouraged to stay. And even if you leave, you're encouraged to give back and come back, and, even if you're living abroad, like many people do, like you are doing. So I really would like to support Charlene. I don't know if we can just have some sort of initiative, even as a group, to push some kind of initiative with, even with it, we can go through alumni of high schools, there are all sorts of opportunities that we should really try for fundraising and so on. I think even if we don't have to wait on the government, but also to push the government to support. Yeah. So I fully support.
The good way to do it is to change curriculum so it becomes required that, as a student finishes, by the time they finish primary school, they should have had this experience. By the time they finish high school, this experience, and then written into the university curriculum too, that they have to spend, a summer somewhere in some, you know, or a week or something, but start to formalize it. So
just one more thing. These were engineering students. So we talked about exchanging technology. We talked about them learning how to plait the truly to make the benab. And then the Tushaw was begging them to come back and help to build some structures in concrete, you know, bring their, so there's so much that we can do as Guyanese without speaking about togetherness. Just do it. Just do it.
for sure. Well, thank you so much. Are there any plans for fundraising, donations to support this initiative? Who is that? That's Galaxy Tab A sending a Q&A. I think hopefully we could have more of these discussions, and then sort of, you know, if it's the university that wants to start a program or something that we could support. Somebody has land that wants to be, you know, for us to all get together and look at, you know, trying to work on a project together. I think that would be exciting. We do a lot of talk and we don't do a lot of experimental and piloting and working together. So.
If I could just jump in rudely here. So just something it just occurred to me as Charlene was talking about that exchange and student thing, and Wazir was talking about let us stay in. So it's, you know, many times, so, you know, we walk into these villages. Like I remember visiting Let Us Stay and being told that, I think, Wazir, it's your family's empire there. No,
Empire.
I don't know. I mean, I heard it was, you know, when I visited, I was told this is, you know, I think, you know, just the Khans or the Mohammeds or, you know, old, but it's what I think it just hit me that I really didn't understand. I mean, you can look at a map, you can read things in the papers which are very abstract, and I think sometimes we need to go and stand on those spaces.
Mhm.
I know when Melissa, I asked Melissa about Victoria and the community visit and Cujo to understand what did Cujo Mac persons see, and you know, what does it mean now 3 generations. And if you stand in that space, I think, because, you know, we're so abstract from all of this. So I just say, like, I've been into some of that. I went into the saying to talk about, you know, the domestic violence workshops. You go into the villages and go and sing Ramain or whatever. I mean, in some of the places we go for the Mandirs, you realize, hold on a minute, this Mandir has been here. There's been this land for 100 years. There's some connection to history, but not understanding the front lands, this thing with children's property that Melissa brought up, you know, the communal, all the complexities of who owns what, where things are planted. You know, I think sometimes we need to do our own tours. I use the word tour, but it's a visit which grounds us to understand a little bit more that what you're talking about and why, you know, how one thing might be different from another. Like Wazir said, so is this a plot of land that was left back by an Indian family? Do they still claim it, or was there exchange, or, you know, whatever happened? Or, you know, there's this story about Demerara River. Two women were explaining to me about planting along the Demerara River. Another friend I know, she was telling me that there was something with her family from the Pomeroon River where someone of her and her great great grandmother, I think, she thought planted coffee on the Pomeroon River, but she does. They know that she's supposed to have some inheritance there of land, but, you know, there's no connection or records. And but yeah, it's just understanding this, you know. I think sometimes yeah. Um, the map helped in one way, but, you know, and that when things are built over it, you know, so when an airport is being built and people are moved off, or the state, this thing named the state claims back this thing. What does that mean for the history of the place? Like when we heard the last man from Nissel wanted high-rise apartments on the sugar estates, and wondering, you know, it was going to be like a Dubai, you know, expensive property on the sugar estate land. It's like, you know.
But the question, that's the scary part. Like, that is a discussion that people, you know, that folks think is development. Like when you talk to folks in the Caribbean, it's like Singapore or now Dubai for Guyana, and sort of how do you, I don't know if you could push back against that, if that's what the majority want.
Yeah, but Maya, when they talk about these development and they say that Guyana can be the breadbasket for the Caribbean, yeah? If we go the Dubai route, how will Guyana become
You'll
the
never be,
breadbasket for the
yeah.
Caribbean?
I mean, Dubai is not a breadbasket anywhere.
See? So the answer is small farming. The sugar lands must go to a new breed of small farmers with a plan that is well organized.
Yeah.
Right? And we can do it. It's not hard to do. It's just that there is no support from the IMF and the World Bank and the neoliberals and the government.
Yeah, but you do wonder how much do we need that support, or if we, you know, is there enough within diaspora and local, you know, just within Guyanese dollars to commit and do it. Video, you know, the Barbadian prime minister had started this thing that was supposed to be going on this year to celebrate their independence. It was a parish each month. They were celebrating a parish each month, and she would hold sort of meeting in the parish, and everybody can come and just give ideas or questions, and just you know, and she would direct, you know, okay, here's how we're gonna address this. That's a great idea. But then they were putting on different activities and events, and it was really appealing to all Barbadians to sort of come to each parish to learn about the parish. And that could potentially be something to that kind of model, not government doing it, but like a group of local Guyanese, like, you know, led by you and the university and Lena and so on, and Melissa, saying that we're going to sort of do this, getting to know Guyana from village to village.
There's
people who live
sorry.
there to sort
So,
of
but there's something else that I'm learning as well, and I mean, with the emergence of the housing schemes behind a lot of the villages, and so the dynamic of the village is also changing. So there's a whole set of, I mean, and again, because I'm a tongue person, unfortunately, you know, I'm second generation Georgetown born Maya. I know we were middle class people in town, and we really mocked all those country. Maya, we owe apologies to all those country children that we used to laugh at coming to school from far away. So we have to owe apologies. Wazir, your nieces came all the way to Bishops, you know, and yeah, you know, so, you know, we used to think that them country children, and so we owe a lot of apologies to them, you know, all of us tongue people. But you know, it's I don't know who, like I had this question, like I went in Maripo, and you were back at Maripo, and so then trying to understand, like I don't think even people live in those villages in the same way. You know, like the old families, like even Buxton, Victoria, when I try and gaff with people from Buxton, and so it's very connected. You know, so I don't even know how. I mean, I know Victoria had that project with the mangrove. I mean, it's called a tour, but it's yeah, you know, it's just how do you make, and I guess it's the people who are living there now, even if they're new persons in the village. I mean, the question was there you had when we had our groundings with the culture story, where if you come to a place and live, you know, what happened around here 100 years? Are you interested in what's going on? And I know there's a spiritual kind of thing where, for example, some religious people might talk. In some of the Hindu traditions, it's so, oh, you know, there was a land master here, you have to do a puja, you know, or there's a particular
Dutchman in every village.
Dutchman somewhere, and you know, you never know the place where you buy or you're not supposed to walk. And new people coming in the area are told, y'all make sure y'all don't walk. Right, but as it says, you know, beyond the tour, I don't know how and again, as you said, who does this and who's the energy and what is the interest, given this focus on oil and gas, given the political divisions, very complicated.
I'm interrupting you. I might come to your petition soon, because I believe if all university students and even upper school, high school, are made to learn linguistics as a mandatory subject, that will take them into the field work to discover. So there's a, John Rickford used to say, if everybody became a linguist, the world would be a better place. So, I mean, I'm
we
joking, but I enjoy it.
we can get him to describe and explain and put it together and tell us how we need to do that. And even take advantage, like all the students who are, you know, just, yeah, empower every student to start doing that. We even are trying to get our own mom to like just sit in front of the, you know, the computer and talk and record herself, but she dismisses it, you know, and so it's just all this stuff is not passed down. You know,
Right. So you get a stranger to come, a young student that you can't say no to.
yeah. we have to do that. I think that should be something we should really try and do, especially now. So
yeah. We work cut out for everybody.
Yeah. Well, this was great. Thanks, everyone. And I think, you know, we definitely should continue it. So we'll plan on doing more. And if anybody else wants to, you know, talk about, give a presentation the way Wazir did, just send us a message and we'll do that. And then it seemed like we presented for 30 minutes and talked for 2 hours.
Forever.
So thanks so much. Bye,
All
everyone.
right. I mean, you know, I see a number of people on the call.
Yes, and not every. I didn't.
Wale Omowale.
Yeah.
Want to say hi to us, Omo?
Greetings, greetings. Thanks very much. It was good initiative.
Oh, Wale is in Florida. Gordon Von Cook. Gordon. Oh. All right. I wouldn't call on anybody.
Thanks, everybody. And so goodbye, right? See y'all.
All right.
Good.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks a lot, Wazir.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for your time.
Bye-bye.
And for participating. Wazir, that was really helpful, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank
you
for doing it.
Yeah, follow up on Messenger.
All right. No problem.
All
Thanks.
right. Bye.